Snow had begun to fall early that December. It danced in slow circles across the narrow streets of Yorkshire, covering rooftops, cars, and chimney tops with a quiet kind of peace. Inside the small brick house at the corner of Maple Street, the Evans family was busy preparing for Christmas, or rather, three of them were. The fourth, Emily, sat quietly by the window, sketching snowflakes on the cold glass with her fingertip. Her father, Richard Evans, stood near the fireplace, holding a tangled mess of Christmas lights like a soldier fighting a losing battle. He was a tall man with graying hair and a voice that carried authority and pride. Pride mostly directed at one person, his son, Daniel. "Look at that, Margaret," Richard said with a booming laugh. "My boy's ridden again, they're giving him a promotion. Imagine that." At 24. From the kitchen, Margaret Evans, his wife, smiled softly. "That's wonderful, Richard." Emily looked up briefly, her lips parting as if she wanted to say something, but she didn't. She simply returned to her sketchbook. She was 21 now, studying design, and had recently finished a short internship at a small art firm in London. But no one seemed to care much about that. Her father often described her work as cute little drawings. The house smelled of cinnamon, pine, and roasted nuts, the usual Christmas fragrance that once made Emily feel warm. But this year, it only reminded her how invisible she'd become. Richard continued to talk about Daniel, his golden boy. "He'll be home tomorrow," Richard said proudly. "First class from Manchester. He said he'll bring that fancy wine he's been talking about." Emily smiled politely. "That's nice, Dad." But her father didn't notice. He was already back on the phone, laughing with his brother about Daniel's latest achievement. It wasn't always like this. When they were kids, Emily and Daniel were inseparable. She'd follow him around, helping with school projects, baking cookies with him for Christmas mornings. But as they grew older, their father's words began to create a quiet wall between them. "Daniel, you're the man of the house," he'd say. "You'll make me proud one day." Then he'd glance at Emily and add, almost as an afterthought, "And you, dear, just help your mum, won't you?" That one sentence, repeated over the years, became her cage. The day before Christmas Eve, the house was filled with activity. Margaret baked pies, Richard hung decorations, and Emily quietly wrapped gifts. She'd saved for months to buy her father a watch. Nothing fancy, just something she felt he'd love. It was silver, with a simple engraving on the back. "To Dad, who taught me to dream." She wrapped it carefully with red ribbon and wrote his name in her neat handwriting. Later that evening, she went to show her mother. "Mum," she said softly, holding out the box, "I got something for Dad. Think he'll like it." Margaret smiled, her eyes warm but tired. "He will, love. He just doesn't always know how to show it." Emily nodded, pretending to believe her. That night, when Daniel finally arrived, the house came alive. Richard's laughter echoed through every corner. "Daniel, my boy," he shouted, hugging him tightly. "Look at you. You've grown thinner, must be all that office work." They sat by the fire, drinking hot chocolate, while Emily stood near the doorway, smiling faintly. Daniel turned to her with a grin. "Hey, Em. Long time. You look grown up." She chuckled softly. "It's been a few years, Danny." But before she could say more, Richard clapped his hands. "Come on, let's toast to Daniel. To success, to pride, to the Evans name." Margaret poured the drinks, and Emily raised her glass quietly. No one noticed that her glass was still empty. Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, Emily stayed awake. The lights from the Christmas tree flickered softly across her face. She reached for her sketchbook and drew the scene before her: her father, her brother, her mother, and herself, standing at the edge, slightly out of frame. It wasn't bitterness she felt. It was longing, the kind that doesn't shout but lingers like cold breath on glass. She turned off the lights and whispered to herself, "Merry Christmas, Dad." Years slipped away like snow melting on warm pavement. The Evans house on Maple Street didn't change much. The same brick walls, the same ivy creeping along the side, and the same golden plaque on the door that read, "Home Sweet Home." But inside, everything had changed. Daniel's career had soared. He was now a senior executive at a tech company in Manchester, Photos of him in suits, shaking hands with big names, now covered the living room shelves. Richard had framed every article, every certificate. His pride wasn't subtle, it hung on every wall. Emily, on the other hand, had finished art school quietly. She'd started working at a small design studio, not far from home. Her work, posters, illustrations, little sketches for local cafes, brought her a modest income but immense joy. Yet, to her father, it was nothing remarkable. It was a Saturday afternoon when the first real wound left a scar. Richard was showing Daniel's recent article to a neighbor. "See this. My boy got mentioned in the Manchester Times. Front page. They said he's a visionary young leader." The neighbor nodded, impressed. "And what about your daughter, Richard? She's working too, isn't she?" Richard chuckled, waving his hand dismissively. "Ah, Emily does a bit of art, drawings and such. You know how girls are." Emily heard it. She was carrying a tray of tea from the kitchen. The cups rattled slightly in her trembling hands, but she said nothing. That night, she sat in her room, staring at her old sketchbook, the one filled with pictures of her family. She flipped through each page until she reached one from her childhood, her father holding Daniel's hand while she stood in the background, holding a Christmas star. The caption she'd written as a child still made her chest ache. "Me and my family, Christmas forever." The following Christmas, Daniel couldn't come home. He was in America for a conference. He sent gifts, expensive perfumes, gadgets, and a luxury watch for his father. Emily bought something simple, a hand-painted photo frame with their family picture inside. When Richard opened it, he smiled briefly but placed it aside without comment. The watch, however, he showed to everyone. "Look at this craftsmanship," he exclaimed. "Daniel always knows how to choose the best." Margaret noticed the hurt in Emily's eyes. She sat beside her daughter and held her hand. "He doesn't mean it, love. He's proud in his own way." Emily smiled faintly. "Yeah, Mum. His way." Time kept moving. Emily grew quieter, Daniel grew busier. He visited rarely, and when he did, it was for a night or two. Richard still called him every week, his voice lighting up every time the phone rang. "Danny, my boy. How's life treating you? Eating well? Driving that new car yet?" And every time, Emily would walk past the living room, unnoticed, unheard, unseen. One evening, she returned home from work to find her father watching old videos on the TV. It was Daniel's graduation ceremony. Richard was laughing. "I still remember this day. Look at him, Margaret, look how sharp he looked in that suit." Emily leaned against the doorway. "Dad," she said softly, "I graduated too, remember? You were there." He didn't look away from the screen. "Of course, love. Of course," he said absently. But she could tell, he didn't remember. One night, Emily overheard her parents talking in the kitchen. Margaret's voice was tired. "You never ask about Emily's work, Richard. She's doing so well. Her posters are in half the cafes in town." Richard sighed. "Oh, come on, Margaret. Art doesn't pay the bills. She should have done something serious like her brother." Margaret turned to him. "You mean something you can brag about?" There was a long silence. Emily stood outside the door, clutching her sketchbook, tears forming in her eyes. She turned and went back to her room without a sound. That night, she drew something different. Not her family, not the snow, not the Christmas tree. She drew a small empty chair in front of a fireplace, with stockings hanging for everyone except her. The next few years moved quickly. Emily moved to London for work. She rarely came home, though she spoke to her mother often. Her father barely called, he said he was too busy. Daniel, meanwhile, had moved to New York. He rarely called at all. The Evans house on Maple Street grew quieter, the laughter that once filled it now replaced by the ticking of an old clock. One day, Margaret fell ill. Emily rushed home, taking leave from work. She nursed her mother for weeks, cooking, cleaning, and running errands while her father struggled to keep up. Daniel promised to visit, but never did. When Margaret recovered, she sat beside Emily on the porch one evening, holding her hand. "You've got your father's heart, you know," she said softly. Emily looked confused. "You mean his temper?" Margaret smiled faintly. "No, love. His loyalty. He may not see it, but you're more like him than you think. Emily laughed through her tears. Then maybe he should look in the mirror once in a while. They both chuckled, but deep down, the hurt remained. That winter, something inside Richard began to change. Maybe it was age, maybe it was loneliness, but he started missing Daniel more and more. He'd stare at the phone, waiting for it to ring. Sometimes, he'd talk to Margaret about what Daniel must be doing now, as if it were a bedtime story. Emily noticed. She didn't hate her brother, but she couldn't understand why her father still worshipped a man who'd barely looked back. One night, Emily came home for Christmas after years. The house looked the same, but quieter, colder. She entered the living room, expecting the smell of pine and cinnamon. Instead, she found dust on the shelves and a half-lit Christmas tree. Her father sat by the fire, his hands trembling slightly, a blanket over his legs. "Emily," he said, surprised. "You came." She smiled. "Of course, Dad. It's Christmas." He nodded slowly, his eyes softening for the first time in years. "It's been a while." She helped him hang the remaining ornaments, silently fixing the crooked star on top. When she turned, she saw him looking at an old photograph, Daniel's graduation picture again. Her smile faded. He noticed. "You were there too, weren't you?" he asked, almost uncertain. Emily nodded. "Yes, Dad. I always was." The winters in Yorkshire grew colder after Margaret passed away. It happened quietly, no warning, no drama. Just one morning, Richard found her slumped by the kitchen window, her cup of tea still warm beside her hand. Emily came running the same day, her eyes swollen and her voice barely a whisper. "Daniel didn't make it. He called 2 days later. I tried to book a flight, Dad, but work's a mess right now." Richard had said nothing, only hung up the phone. After the funeral, the house felt unbearably still. The ticking clock on the wall grew louder, as if mocking them both. Emily stayed for a few weeks, helping her father sort through things, her mother's shawls, her recipe books, her half-finished knitting. Each object seemed to hold her mother's voice. And sometimes, Emily thought she heard her whisper, "Be patient, love. He'll see you one day." But Richard didn't see. Not yet. After a month, Emily returned to London. She'd been offered a full-time position as a creative designer at a small publishing house, her dream job. She called her father every few days. Most times, he didn't pick up. When he did, the conversation always circled back to Daniel. "Your brother's in Singapore now," he'd say proudly. "Running a big project. He might even make director next year." Emily would smile into the phone, her tone calm. "That's wonderful, Dad." But inside, her heart ached. He never asked about her job, her days, or her art. Only about her brother. Always about her brother. One day, she visited home unexpectedly. Richard was sitting in the garden, wrapped in his old brown coat, staring at the roses that had long withered. "Dad," she called softly. He turned slowly, surprised. "Emily. What are you doing here?" She smiled. "Thought I'd check on you. You haven't been answering my calls." He frowned slightly. "Oh, the phone's been acting up. Besides, I've been busy." Emily glanced around. The garden was overgrown, tools scattered everywhere. "Busy with what?" she asked, half smiling. He chuckled dryly. "Just life, love. You wouldn't understand." Her smile faded. She spent the weekend cleaning, fixing, cooking, the things Margaret used to do. And every time she passed by the living room, she saw the same photo of Daniel on the mantelpiece, polished, framed, shining. Her own picture, from her art exhibition, lay face down behind it. A few weeks later, Richard fell ill. Nothing serious at first, just fatigue, dizziness, and pain in his knees. The doctor advised rest, light exercise, and regular medication. Emily offered to come home again, but he refused. "You have your own life, Emily. Don't fuss over an old man." Daniel said he might visit next month. But Daniel never came. Months passed. Emily called every night. Sometimes he answered, sometimes he didn't. Once, he said quietly, "It's fine, Emily. Your brother sends money. That's enough." Emily hung up without replying. Money. That was what her father valued, not time, not presence, not care. But she couldn't stop caring. Then came the call that changed everything. It was a rainy afternoon in March. Emily was at work when her phone buzzed, an unknown number. Miss Evans. A calm voice asked. This is Nurse Hamilton from St. George's Hospital. I'm afraid your father's been in an accident. Her heart dropped. What happened? He fell from the roof while clearing the gutter. He's stable, but there's damage to his spine. Partial paralysis. Emily felt her world tilt. Her hands trembled as she grabbed her bag and rushed out into the rain. At the hospital, Richard looked smaller, frailer, than she remembered. Tubes, machines, beeping monitors surrounded him. He turned his head slowly when she entered. Emily, he whispered, his voice thin. You came. She nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. Of course I came, Dad. He tried to smile. Don't tell Daniel. He's got meetings. Important ones. Emily gripped his hand. I've already called him. But, Dad, I don't think he's coming. Richard's eyes closed briefly. A long sigh escaped his lips. Emily stayed by his side for weeks. She left her job, rented a small place nearby, and took care of him full-time. The days were long, filled with therapy sessions, feeding schedules, and medication reminders. But she never complained. She'd talk to him gently, about the garden, about her art, about small things. Sometimes he'd listen. Sometimes he'd drift off. But every so often, when he opened his eyes, she'd catch something new in them, softness, maybe guilt. One evening, as the sky turned amber outside, Richard spoke after a long silence. Emily, he said quietly, I've been thinking about Christmas. She looked up from the book she was reading. You always used to make those little cards. Do you remember? She smiled faintly. Yes. You never looked at them, though. He blinked, his eyes wet. I did. I just never told you. Emily laughed softly through her tears. That's something, I suppose. He looked away, ashamed. I wasn't a good father to you, was I? She hesitated, then squeezed his hand. You did what you thought was right. He shook his head. No. I did what my pride thought was right. The weeks turned into months. Daniel called twice. He said he'd visit, once the new quarter starts. He never did. Emily didn't mention it. She just kept going, feeding, cleaning, reading to her father, painting when he slept. Her old sketchbook was always by her side. One day, she showed him her recent artwork, portraits of people she'd met, quiet moments she'd captured. Richard stared at them for a long time. They're beautiful, he whispered. Why didn't I see this before? Emily smiled gently. Because you were looking somewhere else. He nodded, tears filling his tired eyes. The year crawled forward. By autumn, the garden outside the Evans house was a wilderness of dry vines and fallen leaves. Inside, time had slowed to the rhythm of hospital beeps and clock ticks. Richard's body refused to heal. The doctors called it degenerative paralysis. His hands shook, his legs no longer obeyed him, and he needed help for almost everything: washing, eating, turning in bed. Emily became his world. Every morning she'd wheel him to the window so he could watch the street. Children in scarves would rush to school, laughing through the mist. He would smile faintly, then look down at his motionless hands. Emily spoke to him as she worked. Breakfast first, then medicine. And you're not skipping therapy today. He grumbled like a stubborn child, therapy's useless. She placed the tray on his lap. So is self-pity. He looked at her then, really looked, and saw traces of Margaret in the tilt of her head, the gentleness of her scolding. I don't deserve you, he murmured. Emily smiled without meeting his eyes. Let's not start that again. In the evenings, she would light a single candle by the window. She said it helped her mother's memory stay close. Richard often watched the flame tremble. She always kept this house bright, he whispered once. Even when I didn't. Emily glanced up from her sketchbook. She did. And you helped, sometimes. He chuckled weakly. Only sometimes, She nodded. Mostly when she made you tea first. For the first time in years, both of them laughed, soft, genuine, shared. It filled the small room like sunlight after a storm. But the laughter faded quickly as winter approached. Richard's health worsened. The doctors suggested constant care. Emily sold her flat in London and moved home permanently. She worked remotely, illustrating children's books at night and caring for him through the day. One afternoon, a letter arrived, Daniel's handwriting. Richard's face lit up. It's from him. He fumbled to open it, Emily helped. Inside was a short note. Dad, sorry I can't visit this year. Promotion came through, finally director. We'll send something special for Christmas. Love, D. Richard stared at the paper for a long time, the smile on his face trembling before it broke. He folded the letter carefully and placed it on the table. He's busy, he whispered. Emily said nothing. She reached for the blanket and covered him gently. That night she found him awake, staring at the ceiling. Emily, he said quietly, why didn't he come? She hesitated. Maybe he's scared. Maybe he doesn't know how to face all this. Richard's throat tightened. Or maybe he turned out like me. She turned toward him. You're not like that anymore. He gave a small, painful smile. Too late to change what was. A few days later, a parcel arrived. Inside was an expensive wrist watch, the same model Daniel had once given years ago, this time engraved, to Dad, from your son. Richard traced the words with his trembling fingers. Then he looked at his wrist, thin and fragile, and quietly placed the watch back in its box. It doesn't fit anymore, he said. Emily sat beside him. Maybe it's the thought that counts. He shook his head. No, love. It's the presence that counts. Christmas drew near. Emily decorated the house by herself. Soft lights around the mantel, paper snowflakes on the window, a small tree in the corner. She found an old box of decorations Margaret had labeled, Emily's things. Inside were handmade ornaments, crooked stars, paper bells, a tiny cardboard angel with her childhood handwriting, for Daddy. Her throat tightened. That evening, she showed one to Richard. Remember this. He took it slowly, eyes clouding. I remember shouting at you for wasting glue that day. Emily laughed softly. You did. I'm sorry, he said. I'm sorry for every time I made you feel small. She leaned forward and kissed his forehead. You've said enough, Dad. Rest now. The first snow fell on Christmas Eve. Richard's breathing had grown shallow, his skin pale. Emily sat beside him, reading aloud from one of his favorite novels. Outside, carolers' voices floated through the frosty air. The smell of roasted chestnuts drifted from a neighbor's window. He whispered, Emily, do you still make those cards? She nodded. Yes. I made one this year too. He smiled faintly. May I see it? She handed him a small folded card she had drawn the night before. On the cover, a simple sketch, a candle burning inside a snow globe. Inside, the words, for Dad, because love never needed to be proud. His eyes filled. You always were my light, he whispered. She held his hand tightly. Then stay with me, Dad. He smiled weakly. I'm tired, love. But thank you, for not forgetting me. A tear rolled down her cheek. How could I? Richard Evans passed away that night, peacefully, quietly, while the candle by the window still flickered. When Emily woke at dawn, the first light of Christmas morning filled the room. She found him gone, a faint smile on his face, and her card held gently against his chest. She didn't cry at first. She just sat beside him, whispering, Merry Christmas, Dad. Then she noticed something beneath his pillow, a small box wrapped in red ribbon. Her name was written in shaky handwriting. Inside was the silver watch she'd given him years ago, the one engraved, to Dad, who taught me to dream. A small note lay beneath it. You taught me too, Emily. You taught me what love really means. The snow kept falling. Later, when the neighbors came to offer condolences, they found Emily sitting by the window, the candle still burning beside her. She wasn't crying anymore. Just smiling softly, because, at last, her father had remembered the festival he'd long forgotten. Snow continued to fall over the small British town of Ashbourne. The Evans house stood quietly at the corner of Maple Street, once filled with laughter, now holding only memories. Emily spent the next few weeks sorting through her father's things. Every object carried a story, a worn-out coat that still smelled faintly of pipe smoke, old notebooks filled with half-finished plans, and photographs, hundreds of them. She noticed something that made her pause. There were more photos of her than she remembered, small, blurry ones, taken secretly at her school play, at her art exhibition, even one of her asleep on the sofa beside a half-painted canvas. She smiled faintly. You were watching after all, weren't you, Dad? Weeks turned into months. Emily slowly rebuilt her life. She took freelance art projects, began illustrating greeting cards again, and volunteered at the local care home. The elderly there reminded her of her father, proud, sometimes difficult, but all carrying the same quiet longing for someone to simply stay. One day, while packing boxes for donation, she found her mother's old diary. Inside, a page was marked with a ribbon. One day, he'll understand Emily's love. It may take time, but he will. Emily pressed the page to her heart. Mom, she whispered, he did. Spring came. The snow melted, and the garden bloomed again. Emily planted marigolds and forget-me-nots, her mother's favorites, and placed a small bench by the window where her father once sat. Every evening, she'd sit there with a cup of tea, looking at the sunset, the candle by her side still burning. The neighbors often saw her and said, "You look just like your mother when you smile." And she'd reply, softly, "I hope so." Years passed. One crisp December morning, Emily walked through the town square. Children were decorating a Christmas tree, laughing and singing carols. A young girl ran past her, holding her father's hand. The man lifted his daughter onto his shoulders as they placed a star on top. Emily stopped for a moment, watching them. Her eyes glistened. "That's how it should be," she whispered. That evening, she returned home and took out a blank card. On the front, she drew a familiar image, a candle glowing softly inside a snow globe. Inside, she wrote, "To the ones who left too soon. And the ones who stayed long enough to love." She placed the card by the window, beside the same silver watch her father once held. The hands of the watch were still stuck at 11:59, the time he had passed away years ago. But tonight, she didn't reset it. Instead, she smiled and whispered, "You can rest now, Dad. Time doesn't need to move anymore." Outside, the town's Christmas lights flickered on, gold, red, green, spreading warmth through the cold air. Children sang, bells chimed, and laughter echoed down the streets. Emily sat by the window, her candle glowing. And for the first time in years, she didn't feel alone. She could almost hear her father's voice, soft, distant, carried by the wind. "Merry Christmas, Emily." Her lips trembled into a smile. "Merry Christmas, Dad." The candle flame wavered, as if bowing goodbye. Then it steadied, burning brighter than before. In every home, there are festivals we forget. Moments of love we overlook. People we take for granted. But love always finds a way back. Even if it takes a lifetime.